Hello and welcome to Grade 1 of the Mid Cornwall School of Jewellery Silver Metal Clay Diploma. My name's Lisa Kane and I founded the Jewellery School just over 10 years ago, and I'm going to take you through all the basic skills on this DVD that you'll need to make your projects. Our diploma consists of 4 separate grades, and each grade is carefully designed to give you a wide understanding of lots of different techniques, and you'll still have some design freedom within each project that you make. And the great thing about working from home like this is that you can work at your own pace. But the home study doesn't mean that you need to feel isolated. Don't forget, you can get help from our network of support centres with things like kiln firing and polishing. So take a look at our website to find your nearest support centre. So let's get started on the basic skills you'll need to make all your pieces. Let's look a little bit at the different types of silver clay. We've got 2 different brands here. We've got Art Clay and we've got PMC. They're both made in Japan. PMC is made by Mitsubishi Materials Corporation and Art Clay is made by Aida Chemicals. And in the end, they're both fine silver, hallmark quality. And there's very slight differences in working between the two, so we recommend that you try both, and during the diploma you'll be trying both brands. You might be able to get one cheaper, you might prefer working with one more than the other. It's a little bit like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They're both sugary drinks, but some people definitely prefer one or the other. But don't let anybody tell you that one is better than the other. There's just slight differences, so try them out for yourself and see what you think. The clay comes in different weights. There's 7 grams, 9 grams and so on, and all of these types are a squashy clay. Okay, so this clay consists of only 3 ingredients: fine silver particles, organic binder, which is a methyl cellulose, and water. That's it. The main difference between the 2 brands at the clay stage is that PMC have this PMC Original, which shrinks by a lot more than any of the other clays. And sometimes you might want that shrinkage. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Art Clay have a slow dry variety, and the Art Clay 650 is kind of the equivalent of the PMC3. This can be fired at lower temperatures in the kiln, which means it might be a good choice if you want to include glass or delicate stones in with your firing. Initially, the very first PMC was the PMC Original, or Standard as it's sometimes called, was the very first product out, and this has to be fired in a kiln. You can't torch fire this unless you want to fire it for a very, very, very long time. And this shrinks by between 28 to 30%. And that was the very first clay that was available, and the scientists at Mitsubishi, which is the company that produced PMC, then went on to produce PMC Plus, which can be fired with a torch or in the kiln. And the difference between the two has to do with the size and shape of the silver particles. By now the silver particles were getting finer and smaller and slightly more uniform. And then the third generation, PMC3, is a more recent silver clay, and this one can be fired at even lower temperatures still and can be fired in the kiln or with a torch. And it has particularly low firing ability in the kiln, which means it's good for adding things like glass and ceramics and various other things that might not withstand the heat of a higher firing. And the reason this can be fired to a great strength at slightly lower temperatures is because of the size and shape of the particles. Again, these are smaller still and more uniform in shape, so they fit together really well. So to show you what that actually looks like between the three different clays, because really percentages are kind of abstract to me, we've taken an original thing here that we've made a mould from, and you'll be doing some of this on the diploma class. We've made a mould from a one-sided thing here, and this first sample is from the PMC that shrinks by a lot. This is 28 to 30%, okay, so that's what that looks like. That's a visual representation of the 28 to 30% shrinkage in the kiln with the PMC original. And then both of these two shrink by between 12 and 15%, and that's what that looks like. They're both kind of about the same shrinkage, so you can see it's not quite as dramatic as the PMC original. And there might be times when you want this shrinkage. If you only had one mould, and you wanted to make a set, a pendant and earring set, say for instance, you could use the shrinkage properties of this higher shrinkage clay to give you the smaller earrings, and use either one of these clays to give you the less shrinkage. But you do have to have a kiln for this. Let's just suppose that you've opened your packages and somehow you've gotten them mixed up, okay? Really try not to do this, because if you get them confused and you torch fire the PMC standard, it's not going to be a strong piece of silver. So really do try and keep them all separate. But the wet clay, visually, you can easily tell the difference between the plus and the 3. And I'm hoping that the colour difference is going to pick up on the camera. Let's get it the right way around. The plus clay is whiter or greyer, and the PMC3 is a kind of creamier colour. And some people see this as a slightly green tinge to it as well. I've had it described to me. I'm seeing that as a creamy colour. So I'm hoping that you can see the difference between the two side by side. The plus is the whiter colour, slightly greyer looking, and the 3 is creamy looking. So it's fairly easy to tell the difference between these two in the clay stage. The PMC original, visually it looks fairly similar. It's kind of actually somewhere in between. It looks fairly similar to the PMC3, but it feels different. Okay, with experience, you'll know if you've picked up the wrong clay. This feels more pliable, more spongy. It's not as firm as the PMC3, and it feels lighter, much lighter in weight. So hopefully over time you'll be able to tell, but ideally the best thing is just to keep them really separate. Don't get them mixed up. Another form that the silver clay comes in is the syringe, and both PMC and art clay make a syringe, and this allows us to pipe on fine detail to our pieces, and it's the perfect consistency to stay exactly where you put it. If you find you want a thicker piping, you need to snip the end of your syringe so that the hole is a little bit wider. We need to stop the syringe from drying out. If the tip here becomes dried, it means we won't be able to push the clay out through the nozzle. So there's a couple of things you can try to avoid drying out. You could use a small amount of polymer or blue tack to seal off the end and keep it away from the air to stop it drying out. Another thing you could try is to just keep the very end in some water here. And the main thing you'd need to be cautious of is when you come to use this, make sure you dry it off, otherwise you're going to get water on your clay. One of the most noticeable differences between the two brands is here in the paper or sheet form. The PMC sheet remains very flexible. It's constituted differently, and so it's quite good for draping and weaving and folding. The art clay paper is much more brittle and stiff, so this is very useful where you want something to stand up on its end, say for instance if you wanted to do quilling. Neither of these will dry out. They're constituted differently to the silver clay, so they never dry out, and they are useful for weaving, and we're going to be cutting the paper into strips and weaving on the grade 2. So they might be different to work with, they might feel different, but in the end they're both pure silver after they've been fired or sintered. You might hear me use the term firing and sintering interchangeably. Basically, it means that we've burnt off the binder and fused the silver particles together with heat, and that's usually done in a kiln or with a small torch. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about firing or sintering. They are the same thing, and what we're aiming to do in the end is achieve a good strong metal by burning away the binder and fusing the particles together. Another form that the silver comes in is paste, and this is good for several different things. You'll hear me talk about paste or slip interchangeably, and they are one and the same thing. Some people refer to it as slip and some as paste, but basically what it is a watered down clay that you can use for gluing things together. If you've got a couple of different layers and you want to bond them together, you could use some slip in between. You can also use slip or paste to paint natural items, so that you end up with a silver replication of the natural object, like a leaf or a wing or a feather. Here I've taken some paste and painted a cicada wing. This is one of the smaller wings, and I had to paint on several layers, very thin layers, and let it dry and add more paste and let it dry until I had something that was substantial enough to fire. And the wing that was inside burned away during the firing. So you can use your paste or slip to coat natural items, to glue things together, and it's very useful. And you can also make your own. Okay, so at the school we've got lots of these film pots, but we've sent you some pots like this. So anytime you're doing any sanding or you've got some leftover pieces, pop them in your pot, and then you can make your own slip as and when you need it. During this course we're going to be using all of these different types of clay. And it's important, if you have any little pieces left over or you're doing any sanding, to keep the dust from them separate. Now all of these can be mixed in one pot. We've actually sent you 2 in your kit, so I'm going to go ahead and mark this pot with the clays that can go in together. So PMC 3, Art Clay 650 and PMC Plus dust can all go in the same slip pot because they've got roughly the same size and shape of particles and can be fired at roughly the same times and temperatures. The exception to the rule is that the PMC original must be kept separate because this has different size and shape of particles and must be fired in the kiln. So we don't want to get any dust or pieces mixed up into this pot. So I'm going to keep them separate and clearly marked original. So here I've got some leftover pieces from previous projects, and I'm going to make a slip or paste, one and the same, by adding some water. And lots of people like to use distilled water because it does tend to inhibit mould forming in there. And the consistency of the slip depends entirely on what you want it for. If you want to be able to trowel your paste onto something, onto the side of a bead, then you're going to want a fairly thick gloopy paste. If you're literally just gluing things together, different layers of silver clay at the dried but not fired stage, you're going to want something a bit wetter than this. So really you can make your own slip as and when you need it to the consistency that you prefer. And when I'm talking about pasting things together, the consistency is usually something along the lines of single cream. So you can paint this on. It's not too thick and it's not too thin. I'm just using a little brush, and I'll pop any little pieces that are left on my work mat after I get finished making my projects into my slip pot. And if I find it's dried out the next time I come to use it, I just add a little bit more water. So there's no waste. There's lots of ways of using up your little leftover pieces of clay. So this type of homemade slip made from pieces that are left over and picked up is perfectly adequate for gluing things together. But if I was going to paint a natural object and I cared about the surface and was going to see the surface at the end, I probably wouldn't use this particular type of slip because I may have picked up bits of fluff and other foreign objects into my slip, which is not going to matter when I'm gluing things together. But if I want a nice pristine surface, I would probably mix some fresh from my clay or use a pre-made paste, which will be a good consistency and not have any foreign items in it from my work surface. I want to talk to you about the different working stages of silver clay. We've got the squishy properties when it's malleable, and at this point, you know, it's a good time to put your texture in or make your shapes and so on, and you can cut your holes at this stage and recycle the pieces that you cut out immediately back into your lump of clay. But then we need to put the clay aside when we've made our shapes and textured it and let it dry out, okay? And this is very important because if there's any moisture left in the clay, when we come to fire it in the kiln or with the torch, the moisture that's left inside the clay will turn to steam and make a distortion and possibly burst the surface of your clay. So it needs to be thoroughly dried out before we can go on to the firing stage. So we've got squishy, we've got dried but not fired, and this might be a good stage to sand the edges if you need to and tidy up the holes or make a hole in a pointed end if you need to. So there's various different things you can do at this stage, but it's still quite fragile. It's a dried clay which can be snapped, so you need to handle it fairly carefully. There's lots of different ways you can dry your clay out. If you're patient, you can simply wait and allow it to dry out over time. I referred to a hot plate several times during the demonstrations, and what I'm meaning by this is an electric hob, the type which you can use to cook on. But there's lots of other things you could use. You could use a small cup warmer, a hairdryer, you could leave it on a sunny windowsill. You could just generally find a warm spot for it and allow it to dry thoroughly before you fire it. You could also use a food dehydrator to dry out your clay. So how do you know if your clay is actually dried out? Well, there's a few things you can try. If you take your cool piece that you think is dried and place it on a mirror, if it leaves behind a ghosting or any moisture when you lift it away, that would indicate there's still moisture within the clay. Also, if you're sanding the edges of your clay, sometimes if it's damp, then the dust won't fall away easily. It doesn't abrade properly, and some of the dust will kind of stick to the edges of your clay. So thoroughly dry clay, when you're sanding the edges, the dust should fall away easily. When we go on to fire the silver, either in the kiln or with a torch, the binder burns away. And what we're left with here is just pure silver. And these have both been polished because it doesn't look like this as soon as you fire it. But the end result is pure silver. From those original 3 ingredients, the fine silver, the binder and the water, this is what remains, which is pure silver, hallmark quality, and it would be hallmarked 999. And it can be polished, and you could also drill holes at this stage if you needed to. We've included a small amount of polymer clay in your kit so that you can do some experimenting with textures and shapes and designs before you actually open your silver clay. This will allow you to experiment without the pressure of knowing that you're working on something precious. The polymer clay can become quite sticky if you roll it out the same way that you would with your silver clay. So if you want to see what a design is going to look like, you can just flatten it out with your fingers without having to roll it too much. And then you can begin to experiment either with your pre-bought textures or some found textures. And this leaves you free to just experiment and see what kind of shapes and designs you're going to get. And then you might want to isolate some areas with your shape cutters, and this will give